Hello, I am Lauren Waeston, Executive Director of Acterra Action for a Healthy Planet. Acterra equips students, residents, civic leaders, and businesses with science-based findings to make informed and thoughtful decisions toward equitable, community-defined, resilience-based solutions. Welcome to Exergy TV's second season. This show originated as a Leadership Mountain View project and grew into a co-production of KMVT's Josh Young and Sustainable Silicon Valley's Dennis Murphy. SSV and Dennis joined Acterra this year, and we are proud to present this new season highlighting the Bay Area's sustainability issues. What is Exergy? It is an unusual term and one worth looking up. The short answer is it is a fundamental concept in thermodynamics and engineering and plays a key role in understanding the quality of energy within a system. We think it is fitting, if a bit nerdy, name for our investigations into Bay Area life. Now here's our host, Melissa Dinwiddie.
Hello, welcome to Exergy TV. I'm your host, Melissa Dinwiddie. The age of the Anthropocene is the time that we live in, specifically the post-industrial age powered by coal, oil, and gas. Over the course of a few hundred years, humans have significantly altered Earth's environment and climate, and it's put us all in some very deep water. Here in the Bay Area, we are blessed by mild weather and a wonderfully large tidal estuary, San Francisco Bay, which drains water from 40% of California. But with the blessing of the Bay comes a curse and king tides that cause coastal flooding, particularly during storms. Our guest, Len Materman, is CEO of OneShoreline, San Mateo County's flood and sea level rise resiliency district, an independent government agency created by state legislation in 2000 that's taking a new approach to flood control efforts that go back to 1959. San Mateo County has more people and property at risk from the rising sea than any of California's 58 counties. OneShoreline's mission is to build resilience to the water-related impacts of climate change for developed, natural, and recreational areas. It has responsibility for protecting against sea level and groundwater rise, flooding from storms, coastal erosion, and even drought. Welcome, Len Materman. You have quite a big job.
Yes, there's a lot to do, and fortunately, we're kept busy, and there's no end in sight to the good work that needs to be done.
Yes, indeed. Well, why don't we start at the beginning with problem definition about flood control and sea level rise in San Mateo County?
Well, as you stated in the introduction, San Mateo County is uniquely vulnerable in terms of sea level rise. Now, that's in part because we have a pretty long bay shoreline, it's 53 miles, and we have a fairly long Pacific coastline, which is 58 miles. And they have different issues associated with sea level rise. On the Bayside, it's low-lying, very densely populated, and we're worried about water just kind of coming over the shoreline, but also groundwater rising in the low-lying areas. And then on the Pacific side, it's quite different. It's an erosion issue. Our area of the Pacific coastline, our county, is the second most exposed in California. We're really second to the area around Humboldt in terms of coastal erosion. We've seen issues there in Pacifica and in Half Moon Bay, flooding and erosion issues there. So that's the sea level rise piece. We also, like other counties in California, are susceptible to these extreme storms, so-called atmospheric rivers that have come through, especially in the last 5 years or so, and drought and wildfire. So we've seen a lot of the impacts of climate change. In a lot of areas, we're similar to other counties, but in one area, we're unique, and that's the effects of sea level rise.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I don't remember atmospheric rivers at all as a child, like growing up in this area. Those seem to be a new thing. So what happened in San Mateo County before OneShoreline?
Well, in 1959, there was a legislation that the state approved that was the San Mateo County Flood Control District Act, and it created a countywide flood control district. But it was only really built into about 10% of our county around specific watersheds. Colma Creek watershed, which is in the north part of our county on the Bayside and actually extends out to Pacifica, and then San Bruno Creek watershed, and then San Francisquito Creek watershed, which is the county line between San Mateo and Santa Clara County. So those 3 watersheds were included in the flood control districts. But that's only about 10% of the county. And when the county started looking at the climate issues about 10 years ago and doing studies, and other entities were doing studies, universities, Stanford did a lot of work about Bay Area vulnerability, UC Berkeley had several studies, Caltrans did studies, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Scripps Institute, all looking at the effects of climate change. It became clear that we have this great vulnerability that I talked about. And it also became clear to the 20 cities in our county and the county itself that they couldn't solve or address this issue on their own. Everybody knows water has no boundaries. A lot of these creeks divide 2 cities, and so work has to be done between jurisdictions, among jurisdictions. And so it became evident to the civic leaders in our county, the city officials and the county officials, that we should get together and develop a new strategy that's cohesive, multi-jurisdictional, coordinated, so that we can act together to tackle this unique threat that we face, this really transformative challenge.
So tell me more about OneShoreline's mission and history, and has it changed since inception?
Yeah, it has. We were established really as a long-term resiliency agency, and our initial focus was on big long-term projects to address long-term sea level rise and these atmospheric rivers and such. And this was in 2020. We opened our doors January 1, 2020. Well, in 2021, the fall, there were 2 major atmospheric rivers that came through in October and December. And then, of course, we had very large storms, New Year's Eve, December 31, 2022, and then January and March of 2023. And it became clear that that was a climate issue as well, that climate change is fueling these big storms and series of storms. And so we had to also add that to our purview. And then secondly, the other big shift was starting from the day one, we noticed a lot of new developments on the shoreline of San Mateo County and along creeks. And those developments were being proposed in ways that did not incorporate future conditions, future climate conditions. And so we said to ourselves that we need to start working with the cities and the county who have the land use authority and approve these projects. We need to start working with them and state officials that approve permits for these projects, and really have the entities ask themselves the simple question, are these developments that are being proposed, are they going to be resilient to future conditions? Too much water, too little water, higher temperatures, whatnot. And we found that those questions were not being asked of these big new campuses and technology and biotechnology and all these new developments in our county. So we spent quite a bit of time in 2021, 2022, 2023, and this year putting out planning guidance for local jurisdictions so that they can put language into their general plans or zoning ordinances, and when they review developments, and now when they review public infrastructure projects, it's not just private developments, it's also our roads and our stormwater systems and our cell phone towers and all the things that make our communities function, that they ask themselves the question, are these going to be resilient to future conditions? And if not, what do we need to do so that they are?
Oh, that's wonderful. Is that what the planning policy guiding zoning resource is all about?
Yeah, that was adopted by our board in June 2023. That was, it really created template language for local jurisdictions to insert into their general plans or specific plans or zoning ordinances, or when they review development proposals. It was also meant for the general public to understand when they see something that comes before their planning commission or their city council, what are the things that they as a member of the public should be thinking about in terms of climate change, and what are some good questions to ask about these developments. Now we've turned our attention to the public infrastructure piece, which is also critically important. There's a lot of public infrastructure that's at risk. Our stormwater systems generally were designed for a historic 10-year storm, not a future climate-fueled 50-year storm or 100-year event or something like that. And so they're undersized, and that needs to be addressed. That's just one example. roads, parks. Parks are not designed for climate change. We see that when we go hiking and there's a trail closed because there's been a big storm, and so we need to be thinking about all of our public infrastructure in a new way, and so we're trying to spread that word. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's so helpful. Well, you've noted that, and this is a quote, huge problems need huge solutions. I love that. So how has OneShoreline grown to take on these challenges?
Well, if we just look at the Bayside for a minute, the issue of sea level rise people think about is bay water level rising, and it has risen already. In the last 125 years, it's risen 8 inches. And that gets back to your point about we're in a new age, and that dates back to the Industrial Revolution. Well, sea levels have been rising, and they're expected to rise more rapidly. The rate of rise is going to be higher. That's the concern, substantially higher, the rate. And so people think about the bay water level rising and it coming over our shores and inundating our shoreline areas. And that's all true. And it's a serious challenge. We have, as I said, 53 miles. We have 11 cities just in our county that touch the bay. The level of protection that they do along the shoreline and enhancing the shoreline with habitat and trails, all of that really should be well aligned. And that's what we see as our job, is to, as best as possible, align this bay shoreline. The challenge is, it's actually a greater challenge than protecting against sea level rise along the shoreline. The challenge is to keep water out of the creeks that come up the creeks and cause flooding on sunny days, and especially cause flooding during the storms, where we're also trying to get water into the bay from the developed areas and from the hills and whatnot. And these creeks are they don't have the capacity for these big storms that come through as it is. And then when you add to that the issue of higher bay water levels that are going up the creeks, then you can understand that there's a big problem. So we are essentially trying to construct a shoreline along our bay with 17 very large holes in it. And it's supposed to be watertight to keep water out, but it also has these 17 large holes. And these large holes are creeks or channels. And so the challenge is with these creeks is what do you do to enable during the storms the water to flow out of the creeks into the bay at the same time as keeping the bay out of the creeks, and that creates a lot of dilemmas. And we're seeing that now as we started do planning and design of our first big project, which is south of San Francisco Airport along the shoreline of Millbrae and Burlingame. Is just those two cities have 6 channels that flow into the bay. And we're trying to figure that out, and we're developing alternatives to do that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a really big project. Well, let's work up and down the coast. Starting, actually, is what you just mentioned, is that the Millbrae and Burlingame Shoreline Resilience Project?
That's right, exactly.
Great. Let's go there and let's talk about the problems and constraints to the range of possible solutions. We've got this shoreline and inland flooding. We've got the shoreline is heavily urbanized. You mentioned that there are all these creeks that are draining out into the bay, lagoons draining into the bay. You didn't mention this, but I know that there's FEMA and flood insurance are constraints, and then I know we're talking outside in the lobby about birds also. Right. Let's talk about some of these constraints.
Yeah. So maybe we'll start with the birds one, which is really interesting. There's a lot of interest, understandably, in developing shoreline habitat that is rich in wildlife, and we all enjoy going out onto the bay and walking or riding a bike and looking at the bay and looking at the habitat. It's great. It's great for the environment. It's great for the aesthetics. It's great for recreation. The challenge that we have on this project is developing habitat that doesn't attract birds that can conflict with airplanes. And San Francisco Airport is obviously a very important facility for our region. And they have very strong feelings about anything that will attract a bird that might conflict with the airplane. And so we're trying to design habitats that are resilient to future conditions, resilient to these rising seas, that attract wildlife that is meaningful and important, some special status species that are listed for the being threatened or endangered or whatnot. Attract all of that, yet keep the birds out. And so that's a big constraint for the project, and in any project that's near a major airport has that constraint. So that's just one. The issue of FEMA certification, a lot of the shoreline area is within the flood zone. The property owners pay flood insurance, and an objective of many projects is to remove properties from a flood zone for two reasons. One is if you remove it from the flood zone, that means you're protecting the property. You're protecting the people that live and work there, and you're protecting the assets of the buildings and all the infrastructure, et cetera. The other reason is that people who live in a flood zone or work in a flood zone, those properties, if there's any kind of a mortgage that's federally backed, they have to pay flood insurance. And one of our objectives with these projects is to reduce the flood insurance burden for people, so both protect them and reduce their costs. And FEMA administers the National Flood Insurance Program, and FEMA has requirements. If they're going to remove a property from a flood zone, the levee system, whatnot, has to be designed and be accredited to their standards. And so that is a constraint because it has to be then following federal standards for an engineered structure. It can't just be a marsh and say, well, this marsh is providing a sponge and the benefits of the marsh, and so therefore we're going to take this out of the flood insurance program. Well, no, FEMA will say that's not enough. You need to actually build an engineered structure. And so that's a constraint because that costs more money, it takes more space. It reduces our ability to do environmental enhancements sometimes. So it's just one of the things that we have to deal with as a constraint. You mentioned, and I mentioned before, the creeks that we have in this area and just the low-lying area. You think about, like in Burlingame, there's the Anza Lagoon, which is when you're driving on the Highway 101 towards the airport, let's say from the south, you see this waterway with the big PG&E utility towers there, and then beyond that you see developed areas, including a big Facebook campus now, and lots of other development. All of that was the bay. It's bay fill. And so you think about, okay, well, what does that mean as the seas rise? Well, the groundwater is going to rise in that whole area too. And so we both have to keep the water out of Anza Lagoon or Anza Peninsula and the developed areas if we want to protect that area, which the city does and we do. But also you have to keep water coming up from below. And so that's another kind of constraint, is how you do both those things at the same time.
Oh my gosh, so
Super
many,
complicated.
so complicated. Yeah. I did have a question about the birds. Yeah. You're trying to, you said you're trying to attract wildlife into the habitat. Are you trying to prevent all birds, or is it just some birds that get in the way of the airplanes? Yeah,
there are certain species of birds that don't fly, for example, and those are okay. Most birds do fly, of course. Yeah. And so we have a consultant who is an expert on aviation and birds, and they are helping us to design the habitat there. So it's a challenge, but there are many challenges in this project, as we just talked about, and this is certainly something that can be overcome. It's just it's not easy when people say, oh, let's just build this big beautiful marsh there. It's not that simple. That's my point, is that there are other constraints against that, and we have to build a certain type of marsh. And not just a marsh. I'm not particularly interested in just restoring things to historic conditions, because with sea level rise, historic conditions are changing, and climate is changing. And so I want to build, when you did your introduction, you talked about OneShoreline's mission of resilience for developed natural and public access areas. I want to build projects that are resilient to future conditions, whatever the circumstance of that particular area is, whether it's developed a building or it's a marsh or it's something else. And so we need to think differently as a society about how we're doing things, that we're actually thinking ahead 40 years, rather than just say, I'm going to build something the way it looked in 1980. I want to build something that actually is not just going to be underwater in 2050.
Sure. Let's go there. Let's talk about your goals for this particular project.
Yeah, I mean, this area of the shoreline for both Millbrae and Burlingame is an important economic area. The cities have made that clear. And so our job is to figure out how to protect that economic area and also provide these enhancements in terms of the Bay Trail there has gaps in it. In some areas, it's basically a pile of concrete and it's not safe or convenient or aesthetically pleasing to walk on the Bay Trail there. And so we have multiple goals for this project to improve the experience of being on the shoreline at the same time as protecting and building new habitat areas that are, again, resilient to future conditions. And then also, at the end of the day, protecting the developed areas that are there, not just from the water coming from the bay, but all those 6 channels that also come from the hills.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, so complicated. And how does this fit in with SFO's shoreline protection project?
Yeah, that's a good question. SFO has a big project. They call it their Shoreline Protection Program. And they've been working at it for several years. They recently completed an environmental impact report on it. And so, as I said, we have 53 miles of shoreline in our county. About 8 of those miles are SFO bayfront. And if you take all the runways and you draw a line around it and like that. And so our job is to leverage SFO's project and connect into it on the north and the south. So on the north side, it's where San Bruno Creek drains and then city of South San Francisco. There's also an important Samtrans facility on the north side of SFO. How do we protect all of that, tie it into the work SFO is doing in a coherent, efficient way? And then on the south side, where Millbrae touches the airport, how do we then tie in and extend the protection from Millbrae through Burlingame and then on to city of San Mateo and south? So SFO is an important project, and we're working with them to make sure that our projects are aligned as much as possible. But they're part of City and County of San Francisco, different entity, different government. They just happen to be in San Mateo County, so they're part of our big plan, let's say.
I would imagine working with all of these different governments and different bodies would add to the complexity as well.
Yeah, I mean, governance is a big issue. Is how do you push complex projects through when they affect so many different entities? And that gets back to the origins of OneShoreline. These projects are too complicated, and technically they don't make sense to do as an individual entity. And so we have another project called the Bayfront Canal and Atherton Channel Project that was in planning and design for about a dozen years before we were established in 2020. And it was a very small project, about 500 feet of shoreline, about $10 million construction, but it never got beyond planning because it crossed the jurisdictional line.
Oh, wow.
And so when we were established in 2020, they handed it to us and they said, let's see if you can do this, because it's multiple jurisdictions. It involved the county, 2 cities of where the project was. Another city was contributing to it because they were part of the watershed, and so I viewed it as a proof of concept right away to take on that project and see if we could get it done. So it went through about a dozen years of planning. They handed it to us, and I'm proud to say we got the permits. We put together a funding agreement among all the jurisdictions, and we got the land rights from Cargill Corporation, which is a big private entity. And we built the project all in about a 2-year period. And so, that speaks to why it makes sense for jurisdictions to work together. And a lot of other counties are looking to us to say, tell us what worked, what didn't work with your development of your organization, your agency, and so that we can learn from it and do something also that's multi-jurisdictional, whether it's Marin or in the East Bay or whatnot.
Oh, that's great. I was going to ask you how the feedback has been so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, as you said. We have big ambitions because the challenges are so great, and so when you put out big ideas, there's a lot of reaction to it sometimes, and we've gotten reaction, positive and negative. I think people are very appreciative of the push towards land use, taking into account these climate change conditions, because that's never been done, and it really needs to be done, and it's easy to explain that, and people understand that it needs to be done. On the project level, devil is in the details on projects, and when you propose something, people talk about what they know, and we hear a lot of comments pro and con. So it's kind of part of the job is getting a lot of feedback. I think in general people are happy and appreciative that San Mateo County is taking this on. We were the first government agency to do this kind of thing, and we're still the only one. But as I said, a lot of people are looking at us. And so I feel a certain sense of responsibility to see this through to success, not just because of a particular project or a particular community, but proof of concept of why this makes sense.
Yeah. Well, do you have one other project you want to share a little bit about, maybe the countywide early warning system?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. As I said earlier, one of the kind of additions to our portfolio that we added after we were formed was to look at these big storms. And so we've been installing throughout the county a series of gauges, stream gauges, rain gauges, that alert us and alert the cities and alert the general public to flood conditions as they're coming downstream. So that's an important one because we have the ability as a society to tell people when they're going to flood pretty accurately, not 100%, but pretty accurately. And so it's our responsibility to do that. And so one of our high priorities is to build this out. And right now we're working with the county of San Mateo to kind of build it out further and put some new infrastructure in different creeks, and even in a golf course, put a piece of stream gauge so that it can tell the flood-prone area downstream, if it looks like it's going to flood, and we can send out alerts through it's called SMC Alert, the San Mateo County's alert system. So it's an important project, and I think the cities have been really appreciative of it.
That sounds amazing. Well, Len, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and share with us. This has been really illuminating. So one last question, how can people find you? Yeah, so
our offices are in San Mateo, the city of San Mateo, and our website is OneShoreline.org, ONESHORELINE, one word, OneShoreline.org. And people can email us at info@OneShoreline.org, and we're happy to get comments and questions and connect with people.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Len Materman. Thank you so much for coming on Exergy TV and filling us in on all the big problems and big solutions on the San Mateo County coast. We look forward to hearing more about OneShoreline's progress. This is Melissa Dinwiddie for Exergy TV.